we have to move into our next segment of the day, which is a live discussion of an asynchronous stream. I posted earlier that the link to the session, which I'll post again, where you can watch the videos online. But I will now introduce people in this discussion. We have Morgan Bimm. Bella Swan listens to Muse, 2000s girl culture, and the amplification of indie rock. We have Paula Propst, altering one's aspect to the sun, feminist perspectives on aging in the industry. And I believe she may be back in 5 minutes, but not sure. Take That, Tipper Gore, Alanis Morissette, Suburban Youth, and the Politics of Consumer-Friendliness, H. Megumi Orita. Let's Talk About Sex, Pop Music, Plague, Palimpsest, Matthew Jones, Bored This Way, Adolescent Ennui, and Punk Songwriting, Elizabeth Lindau. And we don't have Danielle Sofer today, but I believe the video is still going to be up online for you to look at. Sex, Samples, Self, Girlhood, from Donna Summer to TLC. In the past, when we've done these, we've had people kind of introduce their talk a bit. Do people feel like they want to do that? Morgan,
Hi, JD.
Hi,
It's great
Morgan.
to meet you.
Yeah,
Maybe if I talk, I'll move up in your Hollywood squares.
yeah. I think I'm
faces.
still seeing
Yeah.
the others. But there you are, Elizabeth. Thank you. Do you want to give a quick overview for the people who maybe haven't had a chance to watch the video yet?
Sure, I can start. So my paper is about boredom as a major lyrical theme in punk songwriting. And I start with the Buzzcocks and move up to more recent acts like Blink 182 and discuss how boredom is treated as a subject in a lot of punk songs. And I also talk particularly about adolescent boredom and a couple sites of boredom. One is boredom in educational settings in school. Another is suburban boredom, which kind of shows up as a particular lyrical subject and has been discussed in some of the scholarly literature on punk, particularly punk where I live here in Southern California. And then there's sort of a dark turn at the end of the talk where I talk a little bit about boredom and teenage depression and how there's a kind of link made between boredom and suicide in several songs, including songs like Bad Religion, songs by Bad Religion and DOA. So that's a quick overview of my talk.
I'm happy to go next. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Yay! So I'm Morgan. I'm based out of Toronto at York University, and my talk is drawing on my dissertation research, which is essentially looking at the role of women and girls and girl culture in the cultural mainstreaming of indie rock during the 2000s or the aughts kind of decade. So particularly, it's kind of drawing from the chapter of my dissertation where I really kind of use this framework of bedroom culture, introduced by Angela McRobbie and Jenny Garber in the 70s, really kind of like this foundational idea in subcultural studies. So using this idea of bedroom culture to kind of unpack and think through the ways that authenticity and questions of like public-private space is really grappled with in the way that we think of these two canons. So the one canon, of course, being indie rock, and then this other canon being like these TV shows and films that really make up, for many of us, I think, kind of this really foundational kind of coming of age moment if we were teenagers in or around the early 2000s. So I talk about Twilight a lot basically, and it's very fun.
Hi, I'm happy to go next. I'm Meg. I'm at UNC Chapel Hill, and my presentation also pulled from my dissertation research. Specifically, I talked about how Alanis Morissette's music and its reception by teen girls was oftentimes dismissed as apolitical because it wasn't overtly political and because of its commercial success and consumer friendliness. What I do in my talk is I unpack the ideas around parental censorship, especially around teen girls. So I also engage with McRobbie and Garber's theory of bedroom culture and complicate that with Mary Celeste Kearney's critique of bedroom culture. I present this idea of the mom test. And so I talk about how these spaces weren't fully autonomous. And so actually, in order to get some of these materials into spaces, they had to have that level of consumer friendliness. So I go through some of the musical aspects and physical aspects of the albums themselves to show how Alanis Morissette's music specifically helped usher in a way of galvanizing girls' sociopolitics into their private spaces so that they could engage with them. I also put this in the context of the Parents Music Resource Center's activism in the 80s and early 90s, showing how an overall shift over the course of that work from thinking about objectionable lyrics as related to hard rock, heavy metal, to being associated with Black male bodies, also shifted critical attention away from this kind of music, even though it had equally as what would be considered objectionable content matter.
Paula, did you want to give a quick overview? Yeah.
So sorry for technology stuff. Plus I presented this on the first day of the conference. So I was like, oh, I'm on this panel. Oh, okay. So I've watched your stuff, but I'm just like, oh, okay, well, I'll just have a conversation. That's fine. So my presentation deals with the positionality of feminine presenting individuals, or rather feminine assuming individuals, specifically women who identify as women, and how they're perceived in the music industry itself, and what kind of mental health issues come along with the rules and regulations, quote unquote, for what it means to be a woman in the industry. I specifically speak about Debbie Harry. I use an Alice Baggs song because she specifically addresses this issue in the song Secret Hoven, and transition into what happened to Britney Spears in 2007 and what is currently happening to K-pop stars right now.
Excellent, thank you. And then is Matthew here? No? All right, so we're gonna open it up to conversation. Did any of you have questions for each other? I think it's interesting that you've been able to watch each other's videos and perhaps have questions or comments. If not,
sorry. I'll
So
buy. I have lots of questions. No, I do have questions. I loved all your videos so much first. And actually I mean, you've already pointed this out, but I was fascinated that Meg and Morgan, that both of you cited McRobbie and Garber on this literature about the bedroom. That was so great, and it's actually come up a whole bunch in the conference. And I guess I was wondering if either of you have anything to say about this new phenomenon of bedroom pop. If you think about like Clairo or any of those artists who are basically kind of, broadcasting from their bedrooms. So, and I guess like, I don't know, we could back it up to think about kind of older examples of that. Well, like Julie Ruin or Liz Phair, or kind of older examples of kind of young women being creative in the spaces of their bedrooms. So I guess I was wondering if you had anything to say about like the bedroom, not only as a site of kind of retreat and listening, but as a site of kind of creativity and expression.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak on that. So I think what you bring up is really interesting because when McRobbie and Garber are talking about bedroom culture, there's this huge emphasis on privacy, right? And so we don't get into as much of this discussion. There is, this aspect about creativity and having it be a site of creating cultural products in order to engage with larger trends and movements, but not a focus on those then being distributed outside of the bounds of the bedroom, right? So when you see bedroom pop, that is where it crosses that boundary. Something that what you were saying really made me think of is in the final chapter of my dissertation, I work on things that are happening right now. So Billie Eilish and social media and fan artist engagement in that way. And I think something that we're seeing right now with musicians who, Billie Eilish, she recorded her album in her bedroom with her brother, the whole thing. And that's a huge part of the story and narrative around it, right? And I think it creates this new relationship that's almost closer to a peer interaction between listeners and the performers, because then you see covers of these young women, tweens, teen girls singing Billie Eilish's songs, covering them in their bedrooms. And in that way, it's a cover in a different sense, because there's also this relationship between place and where they're making this music. So it's almost as if it gives audience members now who have equal access to bedroom culture a way to live a similar experience as what they're seeing, as what they're admiring in these artists. So I think it's made a big change in the relationship between listeners and artists.
Yeah, I have thoughts too. I would totally agree with everything you said, Meg, like just about kind of thinking about bedroom pop as almost kind of condensing or getting rid of some of that space between fan and artist. And I think it's interesting, especially whenever we think about these same like bedroom records or bedroom albums being made in a time when social media is also really present, which is also kind of shrinking that space in a really different and really interesting way. But to go back to Elizabeth's question, in the longer version of this, so this is kind of like one of my diss chapters. In the longer version of this, I actually do talk about both Liz Phair and the Julie Ruin and Kathleen Hanna as these kind of, definitely not the first, but as these kind of like early examples of really incredible girl-made or like woman-made bedroom albums. But something that I found really interesting as I was doing my research in kind of all of these like online listicles, you know, talking about the best bedroom records of all time, no one really talks about Liz Phair, Kathleen Hanna. Like it's just a lot of, like they talk about, I think.
Brian Wilson.
Yeah, lots of like male-fronted bands or more kind of like alternative bands of the 90s who kind of engaged in these home recording practices. And kind of like idealizing that as a mode of creating music. And something I kind of start to think through and parse in the chapter a little more thoroughly is that for girls, like for girls or kind of women making music in the bedroom, their goal is always to get out of the bedroom. Right, and I think Mary Celeste Kearney talks about this in her response to McRobbie and Garber, is there's always this push to kind of like, you know, you're making zines in your bedroom, but the goal is always to get those zines out to a wider girl audience and kind of connect people, connect your audience. Versus for this kind of more like masculinist indie rock that I talk about, bedroom records or home recording is kind of touted as this, you know, it's like this extra layer of cred on top of your artistry or your genius. It's like, oh yes, we like made this at home and it's like very exclusive and like it's meant to be listened to in private spaces as well, right? So it's less about this idea of connection and kind of bringing audiences together and shrinking that space, and more about kind of recreating and reproducing this idea of there being a individual kind of listening to this music or engaging in this music, and the kind of subcultural capital that connotes. Yeah. So I don't know if that answered your question, Elizabeth, but
can I add on to what you were saying, Morgan?
Yeah,
because it seems like with this kind of movement into the bedroom, we're also especially now with, obviously we're on a Zoom call for a conference, and you think about these teenagers, these girls, these young women, these young queer individuals who are connecting via via internet, and it's creating this community. Because I don't know how many of you are musicians and backgrounds of anybody, but dealing with gear bros at any show is an interesting feat. So now we sort of have this, not just this product that people are listening to, you have this kind of legitimacy of like, yeah, I recorded this myself. I know the software. I've been doing this for a while. Mm-hmm. So it's not a legitimacy in gear bro culture, but it's more of we're creating our own culture in order to create these things and to produce them and to connect with other people.
Yeah, and maybe just to go off that a tiny bit, because you kind of brought up this idea of there being like a certain kind of like technical or like, like a technical knowledge associated with this idea of private versus public space too. I think this came up in a couple of our papers, and certainly in the panel before this, folks talking a lot about kind of the role of suburbs and suburbia, and how that shapes young people's experiences of both consuming music, but then also the drive to like want to create. And so something I also play with in my longer chapter is this idea of like the bedroom versus the garage, and like what's the differences there if we think of like garage rock as having this certainly like more of like a white dude space, but also kind of more of an association of like the garage is a space where like technology happens and it's kind of separate from the private home. Whereas private bedroom space certainly connotes like a certain level of privilege, right? Like who gets to have a private bedroom. And as Meg raises in her paper, in her video, like who's able to get the CDs they actually want past the mom test, right? But I think it's interesting to kind of start to parse those nuances as well, kind of garage versus bedroom, and kind of like where is that music actually coming from?
Excellent. I love this conversation. It's so relevant to my creative process. So Meg, there was a question from Carl for you. Did you want me to read it? Or yeah, I will. With the dematerialization of music acquisition via first downloads and then streaming, which doesn't come with parental advisory stickers, do you think girls are able to circumvent the mom test and not have to camouflage the content of their music, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So something that happens first, though, is when you have downloads. With that, one of the reasons that the mom test appears, and that's just a label that I've given to this phenomenon that has come up over and over again in my reading, oftentimes situating mothers as cultural gatekeepers of the home, oftentimes when children have money in a heteronormative two-parent household, which is typically what we're talking about in like stereotypical 90s suburbia. The mother is often the gatekeeper of how that child is spending their money. So if we're in downloading age where you are paying for that music, there still is somewhat of a barrier there. Once we get into, sorry, that's my dog, Napster zone, LimeWire zone, then we start to see a little bit more freedom. However, in this case, oftentimes these girls are still working on the family computer, right? The big desktop that's in like the computer room or what have you. As we move towards the mid 2000s, there's this really awesome confluence of streaming plus mid to late aughts, right? Streaming plus social media happening. And that like blasts together this artist-listener connection. At the same time, you also see this big uptick in conversations and activism by teen and tween girls around the issues that this music brings up for them, the issues that I talked about in my paper, eating disorders, sexual assault, mental illness, right? And so something that I pull out in my work more broadly is that moment of change where yes, streaming and direct access by social media creates this catalyst for sociopolitical change. So absolutely, but it definitely went through these different stages to get to that point.
Excellent. I have a question that's kind of been brought up a few times, but I think, with social media, we have like Jaron Lanier's book, 10 reasons to delete your social media, and this new Social Dilemma movie on Netflix, all talking about how, you know, we are becoming mentally ill as a culture through social media. I wonder, for all of you, how this tends to change our, you know, relationship to boredom, and how you think that that is in turn changing the music that is made.
I think there's just a lot of different music that's going on too, plus to kind of mix what you just said into all of this. I think it's also the presence of power when it comes to social media versus like a record deal or something. One of the things that I talk about at the end of my presentation is how K-pop stars have very specific things that they have to do, and then they eventually age out. But if you are in control of your own presentation via social media, I'm finding personally, I am currently on the path I'm playing with the idea of creating my own record label. So like I'm in that mental state right now, to where if someone is doing it themselves, they have control over everything that they do. Like, it's not one of those, oh, I have to present myself in a certain way, or I have to be of a certain age. Like, I'm finding people who are older on social media sites like Instagram, TikTok, etc., who are still performing music and still are doing that sort of thing. So I think it's just I think mixing these two ideas together, this power versus boredom thing, I think there's a lot to unpack there. Like, there's, I think, more than 30 minutes worth to unpack. So I'd like to hear what everybody else is thinking too, as far as like, is this a power thing? Because especially with like TikTok being, it's like, we're going to ban it. I think it's been done like, what, 5 times now? Like, the US has threatened to ban this social media site due to like information. And it's like the US is already taking our information from social media sites like Facebook and Instagram. So like, I'd like to hear what everybody else says too. That was a lot. I apologize.
That's fascinating. I mean, I know I'm supposed to be the boredom scholar on this panel, but unfortunately, I've never had a social media account. I don't do Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is. So I have no personal experience with that. But some of in kind of amassing a whole bunch of books on boredom, a few of the things that I've read are sort of self-help. So one was called How to Be Bored. And it was about trying to reclaim boredom and trying to get in touch with boredom again, because now that I guess I think Rebecca is saying that social media and anxiety and being on that now fills the space where previously you might have allowed yourself to get bored. So yeah, I think that's true. And I guess if these kind of self-help books that I've been reading, going like, wow, this is weird, people are addicted to this stuff. I guess if that's accurate, then yeah, maybe there's a kind of an inability to become bored now, because you can always kind of find some sort of stimulation with having a device on you. I also still have one of these phones, so I'm not a total Luddite, I promise. But I guess, and JD also asked, like, what is boredom? And I guess if I had to give you like one sentence definition, I would say that boredom occurs when you have an external lack of stimulation, and that is combined with an internal inability to make meaning out of a situation. So it's both a sort of social emotion, and it's a kind of response that expresses disgust in a way with your current situation. But there is, in many people, a kind of ability to take a boring situation and to maybe, without the aid of social media or, dialing up a video on your phone, to kind of to make meaning out of it in some way. And I guess maybe that was part of why, I thought like these punk songs are so interesting, in that, in response to this generalized boredom, I will, create something to kind of counteract that emotion.
For sure.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, just building on to what you were saying, Elizabeth, and then looking at Rebecca's question in the chat, I mean, there are so many different ways to engage with social media, right? And a conversation that's happening a lot in mental health circles is that when you're going through social media and it's the behavior of endless scrolling or watching something for 5 seconds and going forward and forward and forward, that can actually be considered part of the fight, flight, or freeze. And it's an aspect of the freeze element of it where you're just stuck in this cycle. And so tapping into what Rebecca was saying, that itself can be a way of filling that gap with anxiety and an anxiety rooted behavior. So that's something, especially it's coming into conversation a lot right now, of course. So yeah, that's just something that I think kind of fits into that puzzle as well.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly asked this question because as an artist, I find that boredom that used to create punk songs now sometimes goes to social media. And so it's like I'm almost not creating as much. I mean, I'm just speaking for myself, but I wonder how, if you've found this in any of your research, like specifically maybe Morgan, like how you think that that's affected the output of people that you have been working with. And I think, yeah, like how deep can we go into our process, you know?
Diverging from punk, like Ed Sheeran just said this not a few weeks ago, that he completely got rid of his social media for quite some time and like cranked out so many different songs. So yeah, it's one of those, it's a space filler. I feel like it can be a useful tool if you use it correctly, but if it gets to that point to where it is an addiction of some sort, then it does become that sort of anxiety-filled space. And then we start seeing in social justice circles where people are like, switch up your social media, follow people you wouldn't normally follow, people that don't look like you, don't identify as you, and that way it changes your mental state as well. So I think there are ways to alleviate the anxiety if people are trying to slowly get away from social media.
Yeah, I just want to add, there's also a difficult distinction, especially if we're looking at musicians with a really strong kind of public persona, determining whether it is a co-occurrence of taking a social media hiatus and putting out new music versus a consequence. So one thing that I think is a really big example of that is Taylor Swift, right? After the Kim Ye Snapchat incident, taking that social media hiatus while she worked on and put out Reputation, right? There are all these other factors that would go into her getting off of Twitter, save celebrating a couple folks' birthdays, right? And putting up squad pictures and putting out this new music, right? There is definitely a relationship there, but again, it's such a web of influence. It's not necessarily if A, then B. So it's sometimes really hard to tell looking from the outside, even though I do think that connection is definitely there to some extent. It's just sometimes with somebody who has almost a performative public persona, it's really difficult to determine.
Elizabeth was asking a question for Paula. I'll read it. Question about Paula's presentation. You suggested that some music industries outside the US have successfully challenged ageism. Did I understand you correctly, and can you elaborate?
I don't think that they've like particularly addressed ageism, more as, I probably should have worded it differently, but they acknowledge that it exists and they acknowledge that there is an issue there. One group that comes directly to mind with respect to K-pop and J-pop is Baby Metal. When they came out, they actually aged out of the J-pop, K-pop kind of circuit. And so what were they going to do? So they did something completely different, and now they're huge in the metal scene. So it's one of those, like, people understand that it's there, and they acknowledge it, but I don't think that we're at that point to where we're transitioning to fix it, if that makes sense. Like, we're not in the healing phase of it. We're still in the acknowledging that there is a problem phase of it. So I think that's a huge thing too. But there are cultures that, like, outside the US, I just taught a class in the winter of this year at UC Riverside on gender, sexuality, and music in a cross-cultural perspective. And so some of my students were telling me that their family in Mexico, even the younger people, are listening to older musicians because they have that kind of cultural knowledge that's needed to portray like what they feel, and like they have that experience and that musical experience to make the music itself like take it up a notch. So I think that this is also one of those things that we need to unpack culture by culture as well. So it can't just be like a general idea. But yeah, people are acknowledging it, but I don't think we're on the path to healing.
Thank you so much. We have about 1 more minute or so. If anyone has another question, please feel free. This has been so fascinating for me, Alex.
Hi. First off, great panel. Really loved all of these presentations. My question is for Morgan, and I guess I have 2 questions. So you talk about Phoebe Bridgers at the end of your presentation, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how female indie rockers start using licensing. You also talk about St. Vincent, and I think that there's kind of a move of like using these licensing opportunities as ways to get your music placed. And my second question, which I guess is related, Tegan and Sarah was kind of all over your presentation as I was listening to it. And so I was curious if you could say anything about like life writing or memoirs in relation to girl culture and indie rock. So licensing opportunities for indie musicians and life writing as another opportunity for female indie musicians.
Yeah, sorry, I was just writing that down so I didn't forget both parts of the question. Thank you so much for that. I think it's really interesting. So in my dissertation research, my primary kind of methodology was doing a lot of interviews. And so I spoke to a lot of music supervisors just to kind of get a sense of what that whole world of like sync and licensing looks like. And it's really interesting. So I spoke to Lindsay Wolfington, who worked on One Tree Hill back in the day and kind of at the start of this like really prolific era of like Indian alternative music becoming quite commonplace in TV placements, all the way up to more kind of like contemporary or much younger, kind of like the next generation, I guess, of supervisors who were inspired by that first wave. And really interesting, yeah, just interesting talking about kind of like, of course, sometimes the drive to use indie or smaller bands, smaller artists is of course cost, because you only have a particular budget for a particular project, and it makes more sense to sometimes blow it on like one really awesome song that's perfect for this moment, and then kind of fill in the rest of the episode with indie, that's a word, indie acts. But sometimes it really is about, like, there was multiple folks I interviewed who said, you know, they had this band that they've loved for, you know, a few years, and they've just been trying to get them into a project because it's really, like, they know that it will give them like this exposure and kind of like introduce this whole new audience to their work. So I don't know, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know if I have very much to say about kind of the specifics of that as it relates to girl indies, so folks like Phoebe Bridgers or kind of her contemporaries, Lucy Dacus, Boy Genius, you know, that kind of wave, Mitski even. But certainly there's this kind of this history, or this, I think there's this more of an understanding now about how sync and licensing can work in artists' favor. And less of kind of like a stigma or like a taboo, like you're not selling out in the same way now, I think, if you go after licensing or placements the same way you were maybe perhaps in the 90s or early 2000s, when that was first becoming a bit more of a common practice. And to the second part of your question, this is such an interesting and wonderful kind of angle that I haven't quite explored yet. I love life writing and I love memoir. It's one of my favorite genres to read. And so I certainly think that there's a kind of a whole other angle or a whole other conversation to be had around the role of musician, and particularly female musicians' life writing, and how it kind of intersects with this conversation. Especially because I know kind of the other one of my other kind of research interests or academic interests is femme and femme theory, queer theory. And I know that's such a big, big part of kind of femme culture and kind of like making those histories a little more visible is memoir and is life writing. So I think it would be really interesting to see where those two things intersect and overlap. But I perhaps haven't quite gotten there yet, but I will look now. Thank you for your question, Alex.
Thank you all so much for being with us today. This has been totally and utterly fascinating and amazing to be a part of. There is a link to the videos again in the chat. If you haven't seen it, grab it, click on it, and watch the videos again and again and again. Thanks to Karen and Mopop and PopCon and everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.